Cool.
Great. Hello, everyone. We're just gonna give it a couple more minutes for folks to trickle in. Welcome. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in a second.
So my reception is never really good here. If it starts to get shaky, I'll just either come back in or try to turn my camera off. I live in the boondocks, so to speak.
All right, got it. No problem. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just give it a couple more seconds for folks to trickle in. All right. So as folks are still trickling in, we'll go ahead and kick off. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about today's conversation. We know it's going to be a really powerful one, and we're glad that you're all here with us. This is the next installment of the False Dichotomies series. Today we'll focus on narrative shifting. So we're really excited about this conversation. This installment is going to talk about the role that language plays in our work to dismantle systems of oppression. My name's Aaliyah Brown, and I'm the Senior Policy Manager at Common Justice, and I'm really excited to moderate today's panel with our wonderful panelists. We have Chino Hardin from the Center of NuLeadership. Welcome, Chino. Thank you for being here. We have Aly Wane of the Undocublack Network. Thank you for being with us, Aly. And we have Common Justice's own Emilce Quiroz. Emilce, thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to discuss the use of people-centered language in our movements and the need to go beyond language to affect real change. So if you've joined us in the past for our last installment of False Dichotomies or any other event before, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. We're happy to have you. If this is your first time, welcome. We hope you stay. And we're glad that you're here with us today. So just a minor housekeeping announcement that, if folks have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to drop those questions in, and our panelists will get to them during the Q&A portion of today's session later on. So at any point, if you'd like to drop questions in, please use that feature. So with that, we're going to jump into introductions for our panel. And I'm going to allow everyone to introduce themselves so you can hear a little bit more from them about the work that they do. So I'm going to start with Aly. Aly, if you can kick us off and tell us more about you and the work that you do, that'd be great.
Sure. My name is Aly Wane. Thanks, first of all, for being able to be on this panel. I think this is a really important topic. I'm just recently with the Undocublack Network, but I guess what's most important to this conversation is that I have been an undocumented activist and organizer now for the past couple of years. Fully undocumented, came to this country when I was 9. I am 44 and still in the process of trying to get a green card, which should give you a sense of how long it takes, to legalize. But I've organized on a whole host of issues, but right now my passion is really at the intersection of sort of Black Lives Matter, abolitionist organizing, and also the immigrants' rights conversation. And obviously, organizing in these spaces has forced me to think about things like the prison industrial complex and the criminalizing process as a whole, and how we can shift criminalizing narratives. And so I'm really interested in hearing more from other panelists and hearing more from folks on here around the power of storytelling and narrative shifting, and also the limitations of that in terms of structural change. Because I think those are two things that need to be talked about in tandem. So really looking forward to having this convo, and glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Aly. Emilce, we'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, everyone. Y'all may be a little bit more familiar with me if you attended the last False Dichotomies webinar. My name is Emilce Quiroz. I am the Senior Manager of Storytelling and Content Strategy at Common Justice. And I'm super excited to have Chino and Aly join us for this webinar today, because the work they do is really incredible. And I think they know just as well, if not better, than we do, that although language is really important, it doesn't go far enough to affect, real change. And I think I'm just really super excited to have them share like their wisdom with you all. And yeah, I've been at Common Justice for about 3 years. And I'm super passionate about the work. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A for us, and we'll be more than happy to answer them for you.
Thank you, Emilce. And Chino, we'll kick it over to you to round us out with introductions.
Sure. My name is Chino Hardin. I am the co-executive director of the Center for NuLeadership on Human Justice and Healing. I want to thank Common Justice for having me on the panel. I have been with the Center for NuLeadership for 20 years, so I'm 41 now, so a little bit over half my life. Just in the last couple of years, became the co-executive director. And our work is if you look at our website, it says that we're a community advocacy think tank, and that's all true. But what we really try to be is a hub for the community to develop themselves and get the skills and tools that they need to really forge against, structural oppression and really build out their framework for their own self-determination. So we're an organization that centers human justice as a framework for everything we do, for not just how we run our programs, but also how we interact with our staff and develop our organization. And I'm really happy to be here.
Great, thanks so much, Chino. Thank you, everyone. So let's jump into our questions for today. This is an open question to everyone on the panel, so anyone who wants to answer, please jump in. What is the role that language and narrative shifting plays in your work?
Okay, should I just go first?
Yeah, feel free to jump in.
Sure. So this is really interesting. Obviously, so like I mentioned, I'm an undocumented activist, but I came here long enough that I remember when those of us who are mostly termed undocumented were just called aliens, illegal aliens. That used to be the terminology. Mm-hmm. And that terminology especially became prevalent after 9/11. It was definitely a criminalizing aspect of that. Illegal alien became kind of akin to potential terrorists. So those two conversations of terrorism and immigration got linked, which is why I think our immigration politics have gotten so bad. And I definitely, as an undocumented activist, was part of a wave of people who tried to humanize that language and to change it from illegal alien to undocumented. And that was largely, I think, a successful campaign. I still have to explain to some people now what undocumented means, but more and more people are familiar with that terminology. There was a famous Time magazine cover where I think it said like, "We are all dreamers," and that sort of shifted the national language around being, undocumented. But as I continued to organize around this issue, I think that things got really complicated for me because, especially as I started to do more racial justice organizing, which had to do with interacting with the criminal justice system, I started to ask myself, what does this language shift actually mean? And does it actually change the structure? Or does it only create the idea that somehow those of us who are undocumented are somehow quote unquote less criminal than other criminalized people? And that complicated things for me so much to the point where sometimes I even talk about myself as having been criminalized, as opposed to simply saying that I'm an undocumented person. And so I just want to wrestle with that tension, and all of us to wrestle with that tension of like, okay, we can change and shift the language to something that's softer, like undocumented. But simply because you call me undocumented as opposed to illegal alien or criminalized or any of that stuff, that doesn't change the brutality of the criminalizing process. It doesn't change the brutality of family separation, doesn't change the brutality of family incarceration, doesn't change the brutality of deportation. And so I really kind of go back and forth, because on the one hand, I feel grateful, and I believe that those of us who have been criminalized should have the right to be called what we want to be called. That being said, and this goes back to the limitations that I was talking about before, simply shifting the language did not change the actual brutality of the system. So I think it's actually, I do believe it's a step forward. Obviously, I prefer being called undocumented than quote unquote being called a criminal. That being said, I don't want to create this illusion that those of us who are undocumented are somehow the undeserving criminalized people, as opposed to people in the broader prison industrial complex who have been criminalized. I don't want to create this idea that somehow, I'm more worthy, than other criminalized people. I think that in order to organize in a truly liberatory way, those of us who are undocumented need to be allies with people who have been fighting the broader criminal justice, injustice system for longer. And so that's just by way of intro, sort of wanting to share that tension of, like, on the one hand, I do think that the humanizing language has been really positive. On the other hand, I don't want it to create more hierarchies. I think all of those of us who have been criminalized need to organize in tandem and in solidarity with each other, realizing that our destinies are interlinked.
Really powerful, Aly. Thank you for sharing that. That sort of goes into our next question, but before we jump into that, I want to pause and see if Emilce or Chino, if there's anything you wanted to add or build on anything that Aly shared.
Yeah, I think, for us, language is super important. I think for everyone, language is super important. Not just to us as a society of humans, but like to our culture, right? This is how we communicate with each other. This is how we build collective senses of understanding of what we mean when we invoke certain terminologies and or words. And when you have a language that takes away the whole experience of a person and dehumanizes them to an object or a thing, that's the exact treatment that you get. It's much easier to hurt a convict or deny a convict or disregard an offender. So it doesn't give the full human experience that each person comes to the table with, right? Nor does it does anything to really talk about accountability for any actions that any one person takes. For the center, we've developed quite a while ago under the leadership of Ellie Ellis, who is our founder and has since passed away, but we develop a language letter campaign that really starts to urge folks to call people formerly incarcerated, right? Because that speaks to more of the experience of the person in a humanizing way as a convict or ex-offender. Even when we talk about language in terms of like the historical context of like being queer or a Black person in this country, language has always been important in the way we treat folks, understand folks, and what kind of rights folks have. I do agree with Aly in terms of like the development of language that is more humanizing does not guarantee humanized experiences, but it is a first step, but it's only a step. And we must move forward in terms of really unpacking the structural inequities, and also not just the structural inequities, right? But like the internalized stuff that our communities have, right? There's a way that we internalize language, and some of that can be chalked up to taking our power back, but some of that is very demeaning and speaks to the lack of power, not to taking our power back. So language is super important to the work that we do, and important to us as folks who are, in community with each other.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chino. And just to add to that, Eddie Ellis's letter on language, the campaign that the Center for NuLeadership did, was really influential in the way that we use language in our work at Common Justice. So if you all haven't read Eddie Ellis's letter, I highly suggest that you do. And it's the reason why at Common Justice use terms like responsible party and harmed party in our program, instead of, offender, victim or offender, right? Because once you call someone an offender, you're basically saying that they are this one thing that they did, right? This mistake that they made, or but if you call them the responsible party, not only are you holding them accountable, but you're seeing them as more human than just an offender or someone who just does bad things or hurts people, right? There's someone who is taking responsibility for an action that they did to harm somebody. And so, yeah, thank you, Chino, for all your work, because the work that Center for NuLeadership has done has really influenced us at Common Justice. And yeah, if you all have any questions about, I know in the last False Dichotomies webinar, we spoke a little bit about those two terms that we use. We also have an animated video to explain that a little bit further if anyone has any questions. Yeah, it's just, and that's something that we get pushed back on a lot as Common Justice, is like, people are like, oh, you guys provide an alternative to incarceration for really violent people, right? They always want to say offender, convict, perpetrators. But something that we know really well at our organization is that these people who come to us, who come to Common Justice as harmed parties and responsible parties, often have like a relationship prior to the incident that brings them to Common Justice, where they were just, Mark and Tony or whoever they were, right? So I think it's always important to just see them as those two people who had this falling out or whatever it was that led them to this police interaction that they had, and they're still Mark and Tony at the end of the day. And I think that people, once you get involved with the criminal justice system, there's just a lot of labeling, and you become more of a number, a statistic. It's something that happens like automatically as soon as you interact with the criminal legal system. And though language can, help us realize that, there just needs to be a lot more to be done to stop that from happening, to stop people from turning into statistics and numbers once they have like interaction with the criminal legal system. So it's super interesting, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm not saying that I know we're going to get there, but language definitely does help some.
I really like Common Justice language. I've always had a problem with the word victim. It feels like that word takes away a lot of power from the person. So I came up with this term called injustee. So instead of a victim, you're just an injustee as a person who is in search and looking for justice. I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Really powerful. And I think that a lot of what you shared led into our next question. Aly, you talked a lot about how we can come together as allies in the work rather than looking at how we're separated by terminology and criminalized in various ways. Chino, you talked a lot about people first language and how it's a step in the right direction, but it's not the only thing we need to do. There are other things we need to do to get to the place we're looking at. And Emilce, you raised a lot of important points about how we view people and how we talk about them after certain things have happened. So if anyone wants to expand on this a little bit more, I'd love to know what you all think is the point of narrative shifting, and like, what is the ultimate goal of the work? If there's anything you'd like to build on around that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I definitely want to add something to that, especially in response to what Chino was saying. I think that because of the fact that I sometimes, critique the power of narrative shifting as not being enough to change structures, I sometimes also gloss over the importance of narrative shifting and how it actually can be a really healing thing. Chino mentioned internalized oppression, and that's something that I went through myself, even as an undocumented organizer, after years of being called illegal, I very much internalized the idea that because I didn't have paperwork, for example, that even though outwardly I was organizing, there was always a piece of me that felt like I need to prove myself to this country. I need to prove my worth. And in many ways, interestingly enough, the organizing and the community activism became the way that I proved myself to this system. And as I started to shift and to realize, oh, I'm not that thing, that box. I'm not that thing that has been illegalized. I'm not the illegal person. I'm not the criminal alien. I'm just me. I'm a good person, and I don't need to claim legitimacy from this system, which does not have the moral legitimacy to judge me. I mean, a country that was born, with the sins of slavery and Native American genocide can't tell me whether or not I belong here. And now I know this inside of me. And so I did want to flag the importance that the narrative shifting has done for me. And it took years. And some of that had to do with doing mental health counseling and really sort of rejecting that internalized oppressive idea of myself as illegal and criminalized, and to go back to, oh, I'm just a good person and I don't need to prove myself to the system. And I'm fighting to have access to the rights that I'm owed as a human being. And so that I did want to share with that, to flag that the importance of the narrative shifting is that it transforms you as an individual so that you can have the power to fight for the rights that you are owed as a human being. And once you recognize your own worth and you see what's happening to other criminalized people, you realize that our narratives, our destinies are linked. I have to fight for that other person that's criminalized, just as I have to fight for my own humanity. And that's where I think I'm really excited about places where folks that have been fighting against mass incarceration and folks who are immigrants or immigrant rights organizers can come together and realize, okay, how do we flip the switch on this, or flip the narrative on this prison industrial complex that has literally profited off of our misery and off of the misery of our friends and family. I mean, whether you're talking about the war on drugs or whether you're talking about the war on terror, there are prison corporations that have literally profited off of the fact that our families have been incarcerated and separated. And once you can sort of see that, you can then start to realize, oh, I need to act in solidarity with folks that have been criminalized. And then that shifts things so that you can organize more powerfully towards liberation. So yeah, I'll just share that.
Thank you, Aly. Yeah, I completely agree. I was thinking when Aly was talking, I was like, wow, from a perspective to no papers to a perspective formerly incarcerated to too many papers, right? Which just kind of snapshots insight into how messed up the system really is. And it's been systematic of how they've oppressed us, right? And I think, narrative shifting, we talk a lot about that, especially when you're doing organizing work and trying to work inside like different institutional structures like City Hall or whatever, right? Shifting the narrative. And it's important in that place, but I think where it strikes the utmost importance is in our communities, right? Shifting the narrative is in my opinion, one of the foundational blocks to starting to really critique yourself about how you think. I mean, what you think, right? And once you start to critique yourself to what you think, then you can start to shift how you think, right? Because we can change what people think all we want, but if we're not changing how they think about certain things, it kind of ends up back in the same place. So being able to start to unpack the narrative, which I agree with Aly, it can be very healing, and it can also be very traumatic. And the point that I want to point out here in the trauma part is another industrial complex, which is a nonprofit industrial complex, right? The nonprofit industrial complex can, for lack of a better term, just poverty pimp people, right? And just have them reshare their trauma and reshare their trauma and reshare their trauma to a point where sharing your trauma is traumatic, right? And unfortunately, when we deal with nonprofits, just like the prison industrial complex, there are a lot of white people in power, and I believe they love to eat Black pain. So I think it's important to shift the narrative around how we're thinking and what we're thinking, but I also think it's important to always put a filter on, is this something we're doing because it is fit for our community, or is this something that is being forced and thrusted upon us from folks who kind of hide behind being a part of the community, but not a part of the community at all, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Chino. Emilce, did you want to add anything, or should we?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think everything that both of you have just said is just like so true, and yeah, so deep. And that's something that I think we, one of the things that I really love about the program that we have at Common Justice is that we kind of help ground people in who they are, right, when they come into our program, because these are pretty young people. We do 16 to 26, which I consider to be children still, even though I'm just a little bit older than that now. But like now I have enough wisdom to realize that these are really young people, right? And they're just starting out and they don't always know exactly who they are. I think not knowing who you are or where you come from or why you come from, right? All the things that lead people onto certain paths that they take is really important. And so one thing that we do is we really kind of help ground people in who they are and in their lived experience, because sometimes people are just feeling, they know that they're from, East New York and they come from an immigrant family, but they don't see all the ways that the system has actually pushed them onto this path of, committing harm, causing harm, or of violence, right? Or they don't know that the ways that they were raised with like speaking violence fluently, which I think is something that, to what Chino said, like a lot of, and I'm speaking from personal experience, like a lot of, from at least in my community, violence is a very normalized thing. We use violent language. There's just a lot of violence in our histories. And so it's kind of normalized, right? And so you don't realize that you're growing up this way with like speaking violence fluently, right? And then that's impacted even more by this violent system that you are forced to live in here in the United States as a Black or brown person, right? It basically teaches you to hate yourself, and that you'll never be as good as this other person because maybe you don't have the same skin color, maybe you're not in the right, you don't have the right zip code, or you don't wear the right shoes to school, right? All these different things that capitalism and living in this kind of country perpetuates. So just being able to ground people in who they are and help them self-identify really is an integral part of our program. And I think that, there is a lot of language there. Like not only do you have to talk through that with someone, but you have to learn what to call yourself, right? And what other people call you. and how that affects you and how much power there is in saying, I am this person, this is my lived experience, and I choose to be this way, right?
Thank you for that, Emilce, and thank you everyone for answering that question. I think
I think
that leads
Aly
us.
had a question. Did you raise your hand, Aly?
I did, and it was just to piggyback on what you were saying, and once again on sort of like the internalized component to that. So I mentioned that I'm undocumented. I'm originally from Senegal in West Africa. And I often tell people that I had to learn how to be Black in the US specific context and how brutal that experience was for me as an immigrant. And I'll share with you two quick things about that. I remember being in my early teens, and I remember like this is such a powerful memory. I saw like three Black boys walk towards me. They were about the same age as I was. And without even thinking, I crossed the street.
Wow.
And once I got to the other side of the street, I was just like, wait, like, what the fuck just happened? You know, sorry for the language, but I was just like, why did I cross the street? These are just three Black boys, right? But having been raised as you know, in this country, of all of the sort of media messages around Black criminality, I had internalized the idea, you know, of like Black men being dangerous, criminal. And of course, I had internalized that own language myself. And that's what really began my self-healing journey around Blackness, when I started to realize, oh, I have been programmed to think about Blackness in a certain context. And the second piece of that, which is the sort of another piece of the trauma, is that for as much as people talk about Black people being brutal and criminal and everything, I've been an organizer and activist for many years. The only times I have ever seen guns or ever had guns pointed at me, police officers were pointing that gun at me. I've been a nonviolent activist all of my life, and yet I've had guns pointed at me by police officers numerous times, because very often it's because someone called the cops on me because I fit the description of a criminal, quote unquote, in the community. I remember actually having 2 cop cars called on me simply because I was in the wrong neighborhood and some people just called the cops on me. And so that gives you a sense of how, like, from the time you are born in this country is telling you you're a criminal, you're dangerous, you're a criminal. And unless you do the inner work that is about sort of healing from that and move into your own power and remember who you are, as Emilce was saying, then it becomes very hard for you to fight that system, because the whole country is telling you this is who you are. And you have to figure out a way to be like, no, of course not. That's a myth. That's a myth that they're trying to put on me and that can oppress me. And how do I move away from that myth and narrative shift towards the healthier myth of, oh, I'm just Ali, I'm a good person, you know, and I don't need to be limited by that language. So I just wanted to piggyback on that.
Totally. And if I could just jump in right before we move on to the next question, I completely agree, right? You know, this country has very sophisticated, developed tools to keep us battling within and battling each other. And the narrative around you're a criminal and the narrative around you're not human and you're not worthy of love, affection, clean food, adequate housing, healthcare, all the things, right? That is across the board for people of color in this country. Undocumented folks, indigenous folks, Black folks, Asian folks, all types of people of color in this country. And it brings me to one point, that our oppressions are tied with each other. And I believe if our oppressions are tied with each other, then our freedoms are bonded together. And the only way, you know, that we can kind of like move towards that kind of freedom is I agree with Aly's, you know, healing internally, personally, but also healing together. That work that we have to do as a community to really push through and rise above and unpack all of the pre-programmed oppression and violence that has been done for so long in this country that we can almost say that it's predisposed in our DNA in a way of like trauma, right? That takes entire community lift and shift, but most importantly, community healing. And as somebody who, you know, works in the community, does healing circles, I can tell you that that's no easy task, and there's no one blanket prescription, right? There's no one end all be all solution. The solutions have to be twice as vast as the oppression in many ways, right? The solutions have to be 3 times as intricate as the violence and the structural inequity. But it's not impossible, and they will have us believe that is the truest myth, that we can't come together, we can't heal, and we can build self-determined communities and ecosystems. That is one of the, that we need them, that without them, that we are nothing and we can't eat. And they've put a lot of things in place to ensure these things, but I can tell you from personal experience, it can be done. And folks are working around the country to not just shift the narrative, but shift the power imbalance and shift how we're treating and loving each other. Love is so important, right? You know, there's not a lot of unity in our communities, but that is by design.
Absolutely, really powerful. Aly, thank you for sharing your personal experience and those examples. And Chino, thank you for adding that, because that's really, I mean, that's at the core of all of the changes that we need to make in the future. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to shift gears just slightly and talk a little bit more about this topic around shifting the narrative and false dichotomies. So that's the headline of our webinar today. So this question this series is called False Dichotomies, because there are a lot of false dichotomies that we have been told to believe about people involved in the criminal legal system, and about people who cause harm and those who survive it. So Chino and Aly, what are some of the false dichotomies that you confront in your work, and how do you challenge these false dichotomies?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the obvious one, working on immigration issues, which I think has been the biggest stumbling block, I think, in organizing on immigration issues, is the so-called, good immigrant versus bad immigrants, narrative that we are faced with, which is that in policy circles, because people focus so much on having access to paper, they allow people to be pegged as good immigrants versus bad immigrants, meaning that you hear about dreamers and you hear about the undocumented immigrants with businesses, high achieving people who have like high educational levels, and those people are pegged as good immigrants. And in the policy world, if they're willing to jump through many hoops, including having a lot of, paying a lot of fees, paying back taxes, all of that, then those few good immigrants can one day potentially have access to paperwork and become US citizens. And of course, citizenship is treated as kind of like, that's the Holy Land. Now, that's where those of us who are undocumented and Black are at this really important intersection, because as an undocumented and Black person, I don't have the illusion that somehow if I became a US citizen, tomorrow, that somehow like, okay, now I'm safe, now I'm good, because I'm still a Black person in this country. And that comes with lots of oppressions that I have to overcome. And so I'm much more interested in complicating these narratives and asking myself, while we're focusing on all the quote unquote good immigrants, the star students, athletes, all of those, who are we forgetting? We're forgetting the so-called, bad immigrants, the ones who, have criminal records, the ones who struggle with, just being human beings. And because they're not perfect, then they don't have access to any kind of legal pathway for them to become citizens. Like if you commit any kind of felony. And in fact, in immigration law, there's something called an aggravated felony that was created, I think, in the late 90s that makes it easier and easier for you to be criminalized as an immigrant so that you can end up in detention and deportation proceedings much quicker. And that is insane. And I think what's really important about this abolitionist moment is that all of us are coming together and asking ourselves, well, what does it mean that we've created this category of like worthy immigrants on the one hand versus unworthy immigrants? Because that then becomes a deeper conversation about who we value. And the very concept of citizenship then needs to be interrogated and critiqued. I mean, citizenship was historically based on cis straight white male propertied individuals, you know, and that's still the way that it functions in our minds. One of the things that was really weird about organizing under the Obama administration on the issue of immigrants is that he broke the records when it came to deporting people. A lot of us organizers literally called him the deporter in chief, right? So that's the reality of it. That being said, in mainstream political circles, he didn't deport enough people. You know, he was still seen as lax on immigrants. And the interesting thing about that is here we had the first Black president. And remember all the narratives about, you know, birthright citizenship, like is Obama actually like an American? Like, think about it. You know, he literally became the president of the United States. And yet there was still half of the country asking themselves, well, is he really like a citizen? And the very state legislatures, by the way, that pushed the most rabid anti-immigrant legislations, pieces of legislation, for example, the state of Arizona, they were the legislatures that were the most vocal about like where are Barack Obama's papers? You know, is he a US citizen? So citizenship is not as simple as kind of like attaining papers. It's about what your worth is. And that worth is still very much tied to whiteness.
Agreed. I think the dichotomy of worthy and unworthy is the foundational point, right? And in this country, if you are brown or Black or queer or undocumented, it's automatic unworthy. And then you have to, like Aly said, jump through all of these hoops to prove the worthiness. And you're doing that in a dichotomy that is not true. There are tons, even in the formerly incarcerated communities, right? There's a dichotomy of like, oh, you're formerly incarcerated. Did you get out? Did you go to school? Did you get a doctorate? Did you get a degree? Did you get these things? And that kind of proves to the point of like, oh, if you did that, then, you know, then your incarceration must have been a mistake, or you've changed, or like all of these things. It has no breadth and scope and room for the evolution and the transcendence of people, right? And for people to, quite frankly, evolve, and how that evolution is a prize on itself, even if there's no accolades of like institutional paperwork to kind of follow you, right? You know, are you healthy? Are you working for your family to be healthy? Are you a healthy person in your community, right? There's no awards or accolades given out for just being a good person, right? For being accountable to any mistakes that you might have made, because we're all human and we've all made mistakes. Some got caught and some didn't. That is really the difference between a lot of folks, right? In terms of like Black and brown communities, right? I know a story of this person who had multiple degrees from Harvard, was stopped at a car stop, and the police officer mistaken him for someone else and locked him up. And he was, the whole time, his wife was there, he had ID, the whole time he's telling them, I am not this person, so on and so forth. It wasn't till the point of arraignment where the assistant district attorney said, Your Honor, I'm going to have to recuse myself. And the judge was like, well, why? Because I went to law school with this person right here, right? So it wasn't until one of the good people, right, who had all the accolades, vouched for the person who also had all the accolades. So that tells me that in this country, actually, it's the biggest false dichotomy because it doesn't matter. You can get every degree you want. You can go to every school you want. You can own every piece of property you want. But if you are a Black man in this country or a Black woman in this country or queer person, indigenous, they will treat you as such, which is beneath the human standard, right? So it really points to me to colonization and white fragility. I refuse to use white supremacy because I think that's a part of the language in the false dichotomy, right? And how much we're going to have to unpack that within ourselves to even get to the point of challenging it on the outer of it all, right? And I think the more conversations we have about these dichotomies being false is the more closer we get to the true narrative of who we are and who we have the potential to be in this country.
Really powerful, Chino. Thank you for sharing that. There's an activist and an author that I follow, and she also refuses to use the term, the phrase white supremacy. She called it the delusion of white supremacy or white supremacist delusion. Her name is Sandra. I can maybe put a link in the chat, but also a great person to follow when it comes to challenging false dichotomies. So I want to pause there because we've gotten mostly through our questions, but we do have some questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we get through to those. So we're going to shift gears to audience Q&A. If you haven't had a chance to drop your question in yet, please do. I'm going to start with what we have so far. So the first one is something I struggle with, that is that harm sometimes feels minimizing or too vague. Do others ever feel this? I'm wondering if any of the panelists have thoughts about that question.
I agree. I think it can actually cut both ways, right? I think it can be too vague to really articulate the impact of that harm. And I think sometimes we'll use the word harm and it really is a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. So I think it's very important to get real nitty gritty in terms of like how we are articulating what we feel and what we think and what has happened to us. And also, you know, create the bandwidth, right, within ourselves to think about it differently, right? So I can say that so-and-so, you know, that was harmful, what you said. And if I had just a little bit more bandwidth to kind of like build with the person, I might find out that, oh, that felt harmful, but it actually wasn't harmful because I didn't understand it. It was the way it landed on me. That's just an example. Sometimes when people say things, it is harmful. So yeah, having the vocabulary sometimes to articulate what you feel kind of feels limiting, right? Sometimes there are just no words to really explain the impact of different types of harm, which is why I think it's important to have community spaces where you're able to kind of share that out and build with other folks.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add other than, yeah, I do think that sometimes, I mean, we need to distinguish between harms and sometimes the term harm does not even come close to the pain, you know, that people have to go through when they've been victimized, and you know, even that language is complicated. You know, once again, using my own, you know, story, it took a long time for me to become an abolitionist, and that went through very painful experiences with harm, one of which was my mother, who was killed many years ago, and she was a victim of abuse by her partner. And let me tell you that I was not an abolitionist then. You know, it took me lots of evolutions for me to be able to see through that lens. And if someone were to use the term harm in terms of like what I went through, I would say that doesn't even come close to it. But what I love about real abolitionists is that they really do contend and wrestle with the worst kinds of whatever you want to call it, harm, trauma, pain, And we want to work towards going beyond the punitive model that we have right now towards a transformative model that sees individuals as they are. You know, it took me a long time to be able to see the perpetrator of the harm of what happened to my mom, to remember, oh, that's a person too, and how do we move towards actual something that heals the problem of domestic violence rather than just passing on the pain to the next generation. And so in my experience, real abolitionists are people who want to struggle with the worst kinds of pain and incidents of pain that have been dealt, but who are refusing, well, who are not just refusing, who are looking at the evidence and looking at the fact that the criminal justice system only perpetuates what we think of as harm. It only makes things worse. It does not actually create a better society. So how do we move towards a model that is about remembering that even, you know, the perpetrators, quote unquote, are people who also need to be healed for the community to be healed. That's a tough thing to struggle with, but I believe that's literally the only way forward, because this criminal justice system has failed over and over again. I think that the evidence is overwhelming at this moment.
Thank you, Chino and Aly. Thank you for answering that question. I want to move on to one of our other questions as well. And also, Aly, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your experience. We're sending you a lot of love. So our next question is, assuming narrative shifting is something worth doing, what are your suggestions to bring this work to a larger audience, including getting people who might not be impacted to invest themselves in the movement?
That question feels a little complex, right? Because if you're on this planet, you're impacted. There's degrees to impact, absolutely, but you're impacted nonetheless. I would say, I think knowing your audience, everything isn't for everyone. How we message everything is not going to be for everyone, but utilizing the platforms to keep open conversation, honest conversation, vulnerable conversation is key. And I would say that, you know, we tend to think, especially in the nonprofit industrial complex, right? You know, how do we get more people and more people? And I'm with that. I agree we should have more people, but how do we dive deeper and deeper with the people we already have is the place that I kind of end up having. So I think some of it is using different platforms, you know, to get the message out. Having the correct message and messenger is super important. And also, you know, before we're always ready to scream it from the top of the mountains, let's just make sure that we have the choir lined up inside the house.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And what I would say is that the practical answer to this is we're not going to bring everyone on board with some of this narrative shifting. But I think the deeper answer is, just as Chino was mentioning, you are impacted by this system whether you like it or not. There's no such thing as somehow like you being on the side, not being impacted by this criminal justice system and what it does to people. And so a lot of it is about waking people up to that. One of my organizing mottos is this proverb from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya, and it says, I am only well if you are well. And what I love about that is that it interrupts this narrative of like individual healing. You know, you do well when your neighbors and the people around you do well. You know, it's much more about communal healing. And so it's about bringing people into this perspective of communal healing rather than thinking of themselves as individuals, which is unfortunately what this country has, you know, is addicted to, is seeing people as individuals as opposed to part of a broader community.
Absolutely, really powerful. Thank you, Aly. So we have time for one more question before we close out, because we're at 11:55 and our webinar unfortunately ends at 12. So sad. But we'll get to one more question. So we have a question that says, during a presentation, I discussed the terms of responsible party and harm/impacted party and the power in the language shift. When discussing this topic, I usually make the stipulation about harm party versus victim and really deferring to what the individual wants, but I don't do the same for the responsible party. And I got some pushback that there could be times where someone would want to be identified that way. Wondering if you've ever gotten that response from someone preferring a term like offender to define themselves and how you work with that. Do you work to flip the narrative for that person? Do you defer? If anyone has any thoughts around that question, it'd be great.
Not specifically in that vein, but I have definitely worked with folks who are formerly incarcerated who said that prison saved them and changed their life. And I think, you know, my instinct, right? I'm formerly incarcerated, so I have a little bit more leeway than folks who kind of not to kind of engage in that question. And in my younger years, I'm like, well, you know, got internalized oppression, you're not woke, all the things, right? And in my earlier years, but in my later years, I think what has been helpful instead of attacking it straight on is, you know, clearing the pathway of information and knowledge and self-growth and healing for folks. It is not for me to say what has changed your life and what has impacted. As an organizer, it is definitely for me to give you all the information that was made available to me and have the bandwidth for you to have your own personal experience, even if it doesn't align with my politics, right? So I cannot confuse your emotion for your own and personal experience as my politics. That's some of the roads that create division. So I think having the bandwidth for folks to have their own personal experience and making sure that they have the information and knowledge that is available and let them walk on their own evolutionary growth. And maybe they'll get to that point and maybe they won't, but I think it's more impactful to do it that way than to try to shove it down someone's throat that you're not right, you're not wrong, almost invalidating their personal experience. Sometimes that has them attached to it even more, right? Because they might feel like you're telling them how to feel or what they went through, and that is not the case.
Yeah, Chino said it perfectly. I got nothing to add.
Great, amazing. Thank you so much, Chino. Thank you all for your questions. To those we didn't get to, we'll try to follow up with you directly to answer any questions you might have, share resources. But we want to thank all of you for joining today. We really appreciate having you here. So to close this out, and it's going to be a lightning round, if all of our panelists can just share, you know, where to find your organization, where to find your work, any closing thoughts you might have, and any action items you want to leave folks with to really continue on this work. Chino, I'll kick it to you.
Okay. Yeah, so we are, you can find us on the web at NuLeadership.org. That's NuLeadership.org. Yeah, I think it's important to, you know, be involved in the way that is best fit for you. Take leadership from Black folks and, you know, donate to the cause, right? And help us build our community generational wealth, right? Because they're not going to give it to us. So we're going to have to build it ourselves.
Yeah, as for me, I mean, the Undocublack Network, where we have our website online, you know, we're on all the social medias. I'm not an expert on any of that stuff, but we're easy to find. Another group that I would recommend is the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We oftentimes work together. There's another group called Families for Freedom that I often recommend. Those groups are groups that really try to center the work, or rather center the leadership of people who have been the most affected, you know, by the immigration system. And I think that's just as a rule of thumb, whenever you're looking to organize on an issue, always look to organizations that center the leadership of the people affected by whatever the particular oppression is, and you will never go wrong. You know, in fact, one of my jobs right now at the Undocublack Network is to help create this sort of abolitionist platform on immigration. And all of that stuff is coming from community consultations with people who are the most affected. And let me tell you, these folks are not shy about, abolish ICE, abolish DHS, all of those radical things. The vision always comes from the people. So always look to organizations that come from the people who have been the most negatively impacted by an oppression, because they're the ones who have the vision every single time.
Yeah, I think everything that both Chino and Aly just said. For Common Justice, I think probably many of you here today are a little bit more familiar with our work, but you can, if you're not, if you came here through the Center for New Leadership or the Undocublack Network, you can visit our website at commonjustice.org. We're on all the social media platforms as well. We're at Common Justice on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I think Facebook is We Are Common Justice, but everywhere else it's Common Justice. And yeah, we have a YouTube channel where this video is going to be uploaded within the next day or two. So if you'd like to share anything that you heard today with a colleague, a friend, or someone who you'd like to get involved in the movement, and to what Aly was saying, I think, all of us who are in the movement to end mass incarceration, whether we've been involved in the criminal legal system or not, it still impacts our everyday lives. And that's just a fact. And I think just being aware of that and knowing the ways that we either privilege off of the people who are criminalized, or are criminalized ourselves in ways that we may not even always be aware of, is super important. So feel free to share this video with your social networks as well. And yeah, I think Chino just dropped his
I just said thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I can drop my email though, if folks wanted to reach out to me.
That'd be helpful. And if anyone else on the panel would like to do the same. So with that closes us out for today. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being here. Please stay tuned for the recording and any follow-up resources that we'll share. And yes, please check all of our websites out and get involved with the work. I'm grateful that you all joined us today. Thanks so much, everyone.
Peace.
All right, thanks very much. Really enjoyed this.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you so